Chapter 121 Leverage Strength. While all of the classes sounded powerful, there were two that were lesser compared to the rest. Both Blizzard of the Frost Giant and Chilling Death of Helheim came with downsides that I wasn't comfortable with. That wasn't to say I would never be comfortable with them, only that wasn't the direction I wanted to go right now. That may change down the line as I experienced new things and my worldview expanded, but right now it wasn't something I wanted. That left the decision between the other two, Captain of the Borads and Hammer of the Jotner. Both were warrior classes that gave good stats. A heavy focus on strength with a secondary emphasis on fortitude and endurance. Captain of the Borads had a focus on intelligence that the other didn't have. Probably to give the commanding skills some strength if I had to guess. Where Hammer of the Jotun was a pure warrior stat spread, Captain of the Borads diversified a little bit in other stats. One had commanding and magic skills while the other focused wholly on weapon and armor skills. I needed to decide the direction I wanted to go. Usually, I had ignored the leader-type classes before, but I wouldn't be able to keep doing that forever. When I built my city, there would be guards and warriors who would fight for the city that would need a leader. My fighting style didn't really account for other people though. I was more of a solo fighter than a leader during battle, and that wasn't a small change to make. It would be a fundamental change to the way I fought, but it seemed like the sensible option when one owned a city. Unless I appointed someone else as guard captain. Like a certain earthen warrior I knew who would be perfect for it. The question boiled down to what kind of skills did I need to fight on a higher level right now. There were more evolutions to course correct later. The class I chose now would give me the next 6 skills I would receive, and I needed those to be able to boost my power set further than the other options would. For being a supposed warrior, I didn't have a lot of weapon and armor skills. I had a lot of skills that affected the environment, but not many that were typically associated with melee fighters. The only big ones I got back from my first class. When I first chose warrior and got Power Strike, C, Penetrating Strike, C, and Fortified Body, C, which have since turned into Mighty Blow, R, Pervading Cold, R, and Reinforced Body, UN. I used those skills every fight damn near constantly at that. Champion of Niflheim gave a good set of skills that were stat boosting. Frozen Fortitude, UN. Momentum of the Avalanche, R, and Glacial Presence, R, boosted my stats by a large margin while fighting. It also came with an armor skill that has kept me alive. Frost Armor, R. I had prioritized skills that would help me deal with a large number of enemies rather than one strong one, reflecting the challenge of the waves. I wasn't sure how well my skill set would hold up against one strong monster rather than the waves we were used to. A monster that permafrost, UN, and the cold couldn't hinder. Strong enough that any ice I threw at it shattered rather than cut, and one my hammer couldn't smash. I had to plan for the future when we were back on Earth. My biggest worry and threat I thought we would face was one higher-tiered monster that we wouldn't be able to handle. We were experienced in fighting waves of lesser-strength monsters, and I knew we could deal with those, but it was the big ones that worried me. Ones that exceeded the bosses we faced now. Back on Earth, there wouldn't be a curated atmosphere to keep stronger monsters away. For all I knew, a strong monster could come out of nowhere and attack us, and there would be nothing we could do about it. From what information we were able to get, we knew that as monsters rose in tier, they sought out areas of high mana density. They needed more mana to help keep them growing in strength and purifying their bloodline. They would grow as much as they could in the areas they were in before seeking out new ones. During their travel, they could pass by areas of civilization, and there was a possibility they would attack. Or, if your city was in a high mana density area, settle in the area. I hoped to stay ahead of the monsters in level, but that wasn't a guarantee. I could hope all I wanted, and it wouldn't make it true. Plus, it was unrealistic to plan on staying ahead of the billions of beasts that no doubt inhabit the planet. Those odds were against me. What I relied on most when fighting the bosses and monsters higher level than me were my stats. With Avalanche, R, boosting them, and now Glacial Presence, R, pushing them further. My stats were higher than anyone I knew by a significant margin. What I didn't have were powerful skills to back that up. I had Mighty Blow, R, sure, but I meant skills that meshed together and built on top of each other. Jonathan had better skills than me in that regard. If I chose Captain of the Borads, I would be getting more of what I already had. Of the 6 skills it would give, a few would be magic skills, a few warrior skills, and a few commanding skills. It was a range of different skills that would no doubt be powerful based on the legendary rarity, but they wouldn't synergize or give me something new to work with. They would be added to the list of skills I already had and used independently. Hammer of the Jotner sounded almost singular in purpose, leaving all 6 of the skills it would offer either weapon or armor related. They would push that one aspect of my fighting further than Captain of the Borads would be able to. My environmental and magic skills would take a hit, but that wasn't the end of the world. I had plans on how to upgrade them further than what they were now. Specifically, merging a few of them. I still wasn't sure what the end product would look like, but I had plans for the direction I wanted to push a few skills. Plus, there would always be a chance to switch it up later. E-rank wasn't the end of the line, and I would be able to change my class again in 50 levels. The only thing I needed to decide on now was if keeping my class unspecific was better than not. What it came down to was what would make me stronger in the long run, and there was only one of them I thought would do that. My skills were already plenty diversified. I needed to choose a specialization, and I was always a warrior at heart. Hammer of the Jotner would boost my strength more than I thought Captain of the Borads would. It was different but similar enough that it would be able to leverage my high stats and environmental skills better than anything else. It would take what I already had and apply it in a better way than building upon what I was already doing. Plus, it meshed well with the stats my profession would give me. My magical stats wouldn't be left behind with the +8 intelligence, +10 wisdom, and +6 acumen I would be getting every level from Runesmith. With my decision made, I locked in Hammer of the Jotner Legendary. With both profession and class selected, it was time to get to the last part of the evolution. I knew what others had said about what was going to happen, but it still shocked me. I felt the energy flowing into me from the heart sitting next to me, and it was asking to be used. It was a rush of energy that was larger than I thought it would be. The small heart was a greatly concentrated ball of energy, and it kept flowing into me without end. Vinny had said it was like forging a weapon, and mine was similar, kind of. It was like I was back on the mountain making my hammer again for the first time. Condensing down the ice into the right shape and packing it together. Creating something from nothing. My first choice was permanent or temporary. The lecture when the alien Sipterus talked about the two and their differences came to mind, and what we had read about them in various booklets. Even with that information known, this was the first time I felt it on such a personal level. I held the two choices in my hand, and the energy was demanding to be used. I wasn't sure how long my body would be able to hold it together under the pressure, so I didn't dally. I could feel what the choices would do. What would happen if they were chosen? One of them, the temporary, would take the power from the heart and build upon my existing bloodline with it. It would boost its power, and when it was called upon, it would manifest an ethereal heart over my own, boosting what it was capable of for a limited time, giving me the power and magic that the heart held for the time I was able to call on the bloodline. That was how the temporary option worked. The parts built onto it would only show up when the bloodline was called upon. Austin's wings would only show up when he wanted them to. Same with the shell Jonathan incorporated. The other option was different, the permanent option. It would mesh the frost giant heart with the one already in my chest. Some of the power would be lost in the transfer, but the boost it granted would always be available to me. Always working throughout my body, even if my bloodline was spent and didn't have any energy left. It wouldn't only be there when I called on it, but always with me as it beat in my chest. Temporary would be a bigger power boost, but it would only be available for a limited time. Permanent was a bit weaker overall, but was always available. I knew that nothing would change visually about me, but a great number of things would on the inside. My vitality would get boosted, meaning that every stat point I had in vitality would mean a little more than before. My heart would be able to handle sustained fighting better than before, boosting endurance as well. Not the stat points themselves, but how my body utilized them. And it would help me while controlling wind and ice. Wind was the secondary focus of frost giants, and it wouldn't boost my skill with it as much as ice, but it was still a boost. It was a choice that I had deliberated on endlessly. Do I or don't I was a constant war in my mind. When I first heard of the options available to us, I nearly dismissed permanent outright. I didn't want to change myself or mutate my body like the option implied. The only reason I even considered it was because this was different. It was my heart, not adding a third limb or something like that. I wasn't grafting wings on my back like I was sure Austin would probably do later in life. He didn't have the same hang-ups I did. How much would changing my heart change me overall? People had heart transplants all the time and they didn't change. They didn't suddenly become a different person due to the new organ in their chest. Comparing a heart transplant from before and the magical operation I was currently doing wasn't the same. I knew that, but this whole world had changed. I could afford to do the same to an extent. I would probably never go very far or anything too out there with changes, but for this evolution, I felt the permanent choice was better. If, for some reason, my bloodline was unavailable to me or spent, it would give me strength I needed to live on. It would help make me stronger for the trials to come back on Earth. We had already lost so much family. I wasn't sure I could take losing anymore. I was okay with changing myself this small amount if it meant being strong enough to protect my family. Chapter 122 Frostbound Hammer. After choosing the permanent option, there was a further choice that I could make. This one was optional and it was my chance to influence the result in some way. I could have the boost focus more on the vitality and endurance enhancement if I wanted to, or the magical enhancement. I wasn't able to change it much, but I decided to leave it as was. The vitality, endurance, and magic boost were all something I needed. One wasn't that important over the other, and I didn't want to mess with something I shouldn't. It was already hard enough trying to contain the concentrated heart energy coursing through me. I wanted this to be over as soon as possible before I went pop. My body was strong enough that it was able to integrate the frost giant heart, but I didn't have time to muck about choosing my options. It was a higher-tiered energy that I was using, and it wasn't playing nice. I was glad I chose the material I did, though. It was just high enough that I was able to use it without going too far and reaching for too much. It felt like if it was any stronger, unpleasant things would have happened. Like trying to fit 10 pounds of stuff in a 5-pound bag. With my choices made, the energy flooded into my chest and started revolving around my heart. Pain blossomed and it felt like I was having a heart attack. Alarm spread over me as the pain intensified because none of the others said anything about pain. They all said after making the options the energy would rush into their core and settle there after some time, not start stabbing pins into my chest. There were two things it could be, and there was no way for me to know which one it was. It could be the materials tier coming to bite me in the ass, or it could be the permanent changes being made to my physiology. I elected to think it was the physical changes to my heart being made rather than the risky decision of using the heart. It made me feel better at least. After the pain I went through refining my body, this was nothing. It was rather unpleasant, but it wasn't the sharp, sustained pain of the wind chamber. It took a few moments to finish the changes before the process was complete. My eyes opened slowly, and the only thing I could see was a face millimeters away from mine. "Ah!" I screamed. "Ah!" Austin screamed back. "What the hell, man? Why were you so close?" I accused while trying to calm myself from the jump scare. "It was taking longer than normal and you were grunting. I wanted to get a closer look." He answered like it was totally logical to be that close to someone else's face. "Well, what did you see?" "You need a shower." "Gee thanks, asshole." I most certainly did, but he didn't need to point that out. Time had been fleeting trying to get all of this done, and my hygiene took a back seat for a few days while I was rushing to evolve. "I'll get right on that, princess," I said. He nodded. "See that you do. You're stinking up my cabin." After saying that, he just stared at me expectantly. I turned to see that everyone was also staring at me. It was unnerving seeing everyone look at me with such curiosity like I was a zoo exhibit. "Well, what did you get?" Austin was the first to break, unsurprisingly. If it was only him with me, I might have played around a bit, but the 16 other sets of eyes disabused me of that idea. "Legendary!" Gasps were audible along with Jonathan's rueful smile. He was no doubt thinking about the fact he just caught up to me with his new rare class only for me to up the ante again. Everyone knew that my new class was going to be up there, but we didn't know if it was enough for legendary. There was still another path of power out there that we had no knowledge of, which I had yet to do. While the store gave a lot of information, we didn't know everything, and assuming we did was asking for trouble. Higher rarities were notoriously hard to get information on, and we didn't have a single information booklet on classes higher than Epic. We didn't know their requirements or their unlock conditions. For all we knew, every path of power was required. There was still a rarity above legendary, so maybe that was the one that required all four. We didn't know. They stayed huddled around me until they got all of the details out of me. Nothing was spared, and they didn't stop until they had me tell them the four classes I didn't choose as well. Stats, distribution, requirements. I held nothing back. While this information could be used against me, I trusted my family more than anything. Now that there wasn't a risk someone was mind-controlled, that trust was absolute. After Christian, we didn't take any chances and bought a trinket from the store to make sure. It wrapped around the head to check if there was any mental magic or compulsions in effect, and we all underwent the test. Even me. There would not be another incident where family had to kill family. I almost missed the stat bonus from evolving because of the pain of having my heart altered. It was usually obvious when I evolved as it worked through every cell of my body with every stat getting a boost, but the pain took my mind off of it. I opened the notification to confirm how many stats I received. Racial evolution, F-E. All stats plus 16. Along with the stat boost, there were 2 new skills that I received. The profession skill was generic, and I knew what it was going to be before I evolved. The book about how to get the runesmith class said which skill it came with. It came with runesmithing, rare. Similar to warding un, and formation mana flows, un. It helped with the runesmithing process. It gave knowledge of how to combine smithing and enchanting to make the best product possible and a boost to the finished product. While the skill would help a lot in my craft, there was another skill I was more excited about. The skill that came with my legendary class. Frostbound hammer, legendary. A splinter of the weapon once wielded by the Jotner king Thiassi thousands of years ago. The ice this hammer was forged from still holds some of his spirit and must be awakened to show its true power. Combine with other splinters to bring back its full might. Only given to the mightiest of warriors with a strong ice affinity and bound to them by frost once summoned. Reading the skill was eye-opening. The ancient weapon of a king of old? What did that even mean? It said that power was still inside the weapon and I had to awaken it to show its true might, but it didn't come with an instruction manual. People were still around waiting to see it, and excitement was building up in me as I read the skill description aloud. All of us wanted to see what a legendary skill would be like. Without further ado, I went to activate the skill. I began with just a trickle of mana into the skill, but when nothing happened, I upped it to a little more. Nothing continued to happen, and I had to use more. And more. And more. I was pouring my mana into the skill by this point. The skill was sucking up all the mana I was giving it, and it started taking more, pulling in mana faster than I could push it. This was the first skill that had done anything like this, and it was slightly worrying. None of the other ones were this hard to activate. Just like Mighty Blow are. It started taking stamina as well and started pulling on my stamina just like it had with my mana. What kind of skill is this? Ice started to coalesce in front of me and frost started to form in the area from the drop in temperature. Snowflakes froze around me as the air couldn't hold the moisture anymore. It was making something inside the fog, but I couldn't see very well and my senses were all messed up. My mana pool was rapidly depleting and the amount of mana going into the skill was making it hard to tell what was happening. My vision was blocked by the foggy frost and it was too much to take in with my mana sense. The sheer mana density and concentration made it too blurry to see. As it continued to build, I felt a tug on my mental energy where my law was held as well. I had more control over that than I did mana, but I allowed the skill to take it anyway. I needed to find out what the skill did, and I didn't want to cancel the activation now. It took over half of my mana pool already. Damn it! The skill kept taking more and more building in concentration. The ice and fog grew until it extended out into the area around me. My head started to hurt from everything that was happening. My law being poured into the skill didn't help matters, creating a headache of its own from the rapidly depleting mental energy. Lastly, it pulled on my spirit. I wasn't as familiar with the energy that my spirit used since I had only recently formed my spirit anchor, but it was similar enough to the others I had used before. While thicker and harder to move than mana, it could flow into and around my body in the same manner. I used it to strengthen things most of the time, but it had more uses than that, I was sure of it. Laws were similar. The way I used them, and the way most people used them, was to strengthen the attacks you made. Me with ice, Jonathan with stone, and Rachel with fire. It boosted the element that you had a law in, pushing it further than what only mana could. It was amateur to think that boosting attacks was the only thing you could do with it, we just hadn't found out the rest yet. We had only been living with the system for less than 90 days and weren't that well versed in it yet. We focused on staying alive, which meant producing the strongest attacks we could. Playing with laws and spirit energy could come later. All of that meant I had no experience with what was happening with the skill. It was taking everything I could give it while asking for more. Took mana, stamina, my law, and my spirit. I didn't know skills could do this. The skill continued drawing on everything I was giving it, and it was draining me dry. This was the first time I had used a legendary skill, and it was proving difficult. My mana was nearly empty, and the rest of me would soon follow if it didn't let up soon. It was hard not to wonder why it was so hard to use. What was it taking all this energy for? The suction on my power soon evened off before petering out completely. It drained me completely to create what it was doing. It left the frost in the air for a moment before that too was sucked away. What I was left with made everyone speechless. In my hand was a hammer. Not the hammer I usually used, but a massive warhammer that looked infinitely stronger than mine. The skill summoned a hammer from nothing. This was the first time I had seen a skill summon something. Something that was real. Better than real, actually. Most of the time, skills were just mana conjurations that were lesser than the real thing. While my ice looked and felt like ice, there was a difference between it and the real thing. Not the mundane ice on Earth from before, but the mana-infused ice I had seen up in the mountains. My ice was better than normal ice, but not the ice in the tutorial. It was close, but there was something about it that was lesser. I didn't have the senses to tell what it was that was different, but the ice conjured by skills was different than real ice. That was why using the naturally formed ice from the frost rune worked better than the stuff conjured from Hail Sea. It wasn't that much better, but in a fight every little bit counted. The hammer in my hands looked magnificent. Better than anything I could have made, and then some. The hammerhead was similar to the one I was using now, but it looked even better. With a massive blunt face on one side and a huge spike on the back. The ice itself was a striking blue that mine didn't have. An inner glow and an ephemeral quality to it that mine was missing. The head was mesmerizing to look at. It drew my eye and it was hard to look away. I swore I saw movement inside of the ice. Like a living blizzard of snow revolved around the inside of the hammer. That was just the head of the weapon. I didn't even get to the rest of it yet. The shaft was made of intricately carved wood in formations and patterns that were different than the ones I knew. The wood itself had frost growing off of it up and down the length of the weapon, making it look even colder than it was. The weapon was so far above me I couldn't even tell what kind of wood it was, let alone the runes running along its length. Their meaning was above me and seemed like they would stay that way for a while yet. While I sat dumbstruck gazing at my new weapon, Austin couldn't hold back anymore and reached to touch it. The drawing effect too much for him to leave alone. I was still stuck gazing at what looked like the insides of a snow globe and didn't notice his encroaching hand. His fingers hovered over the ice before reaching down to glide along the surface. I didn't know what he was doing, but he pulled his hand back quickly. "Ah, fuck!" he exclaimed while shaking his hand in the air. His scream drew me out of my reverie and made me look up from the magnetic effect of my new weapon. He stood shaking his hand back and forth while Rachel created some fire to warm his hand up. The tips of his fingers were black. "Your hammer bit me." Chapter 123 Pylons. The hammer was amazing. It was everything I wanted it to be and more. After Austin's frostbite was cured, he was kind enough to spar with me to break the weapon in. With his misfortune of touching it known, I refrained from hitting his uncovered skin with it, but the rest of him was fair game. The fact the weapon was so cold that it caused frostbite just by touching it excited me to no end. The weapon was that cold. I didn't even have to use mana or skills to get it to such temperatures. The ice it was made of was just that cold. It was great. During testing, I used a few skills through the weapon and couldn't help but laugh manically at the result. It was like a mage's staff. It worked as a focus to amplify spells. It only worked on ice-based skills, but that was most of my arsenal. Mighty Blow didn't get the boost, but every other skill I had did. Casting Ice Arrow or Sweeping Snow through the hammer strengthened the skills with less effort. Icy Bastions came out stronger and larger. Ice Arrow came out bigger and flew faster. Pervading Cold got a huge boost to its effect, freezing Austin's armor completely, and we had to stop to let it thaw out. I worried that it would break after it frosted over and became brittle. It was perfect. Everything about it was perfect. The wood felt good in the hand, and the ice was the strongest material I had seen. The knots and intricately carved runes along the wood brought the whole thing together into a majestic weapon of war. The ornamentation was subtle enough that it didn't come off as a showpiece but stood out as better than average. To test the effectiveness of my new hammer versus my old one, I set up an experiment. What better way of comparing them than to hit my new hammer with my old one? There was little doubt that the new one was better, but I wanted to give it a shot anyway. I had no need of two hammers and would most likely melt my old one down anyway. Might as well have it go out with a bang. I laid my new one up against an elevated rock while I hefted my old one up over my head. To give it the best test I could, I layered Mighty Blow my law and my spirit into my old one to make it as hard as possible and maybe give it a shot. The only thing I didn't do was use my boosting skill or get Avalanche built up. The test wasn't worth racing around for 2 hours building it up. The ending surprised no one. My old hammer shattered into 1,000 pieces. Ice shards exploded out from where the two hammerheads collided and showered me in slivers of ice along with a few others that were standing close enough to the explosion. The only thing left of the weapon was the wooden rod that used to be the shaft of the weapon, and even that was vibrating uncomfortably in my hands from the impact. Now it was reduced to a wooden staff instead of the hammer it used to be. Maybe someone could use it as a bow staff or quarterstaff. It was a strong wood and I had no further uses for it. I wasn't upset about the outcome, far from it really. The result meant my new weapon was that much better. There wasn't even a trace of the impact on the new hammerhead, and I hit it with everything I had. It proved sturdier than my law and spirit combined, and that was a hard thing to do. Even the E-ranked beasts with sturdy bodies from previous waves couldn't say the same. Another thing that I noticed after using it and testing it out was that there was a connection between me and the hammer. It didn't feel like anything bad, but there was certainly a link that connected us, bound us together. The skill said that it would be bound after being summoned, but I wasn't sure what that meant at the time. I still didn't, but now I knew what it felt like at least. No one I mentioned it, so I assumed no one was able to see the link, and neither did they know anything about bound weapons when asked. It didn't sound bad and it didn't hurt, so I could only dismiss it to look into when I had more information. While I sparred to test it out and get a feel for it, it wouldn't get its real test until later. The last wave was due tomorrow and it would get its christening in blood then. While swinging it around, there weren't many things that I didn't like about it. It was an overall upgrade from the weapon I had used before with only one difference. The only downside to the weapon was it was heavy, but that wasn't really a downside in the long run. Put the heavy in heavy weapon. Now that I could level again, that wouldn't be a big deal after a few rolled in and my strength started to shoot up again like back before I was level capped. Now that I was getting 21 strength a level, heaviness wouldn't be a problem for long. With everything regarding my evolution was over, I pulled up my new status to give all the changes a look. Name, Christopher Zelensky. Race, E human. Class, E hammer of the Jotner. Legendary. Level 50. Profession, E runesmith. Rare, level 50. Affinity, ice. Faction, Zelensky family. Temporary, faction head. Strength, 478. Agility, 264. Perception, 142. Fortitude, 391. Endurance, 200. Vitality, 151. Intelligence, 143. Wisdom, 244. Acumen, 102. Free points, 0. Laws, lesser law of ice. Body stage, body of wood, northern wind body. Spirit stage, anchor formation. Class skills, boiler. Profession skills, boiler. Coins, 0. Points, 1,497,200. It was looking mighty fine. With the stat boost from the racial evolution, all my stats were now over 100. It didn't come with any achievement or anything like that, but it felt nice to have all of my stats in the triple digits. My points took a hit after buying the heart, but I didn't need them anymore anyway. All the points I earned in the last few days of the tutorial would be going to my family for them to buy bloodlines and get them ready for their own evolution. Abigail evolved not long after Jonathan did, which made me the 6th of my family to reach the E rank. Rachel was level 50, but she was waiting for a few more things until she went through with it. I wasn't sure exactly what she was waiting on, but I guessed it was her law. She wanted to push it to lesser like I had before going through with it. Plus, she wanted a more expensive bloodline than what we could currently afford. She really wanted a draconic bloodline, but I wasn't sure we would be able to afford it. There would be a lot of points to be had conquering the fallen pylons, but we still had the others to think about. 11 people still needed to get a bloodline, and we weren't going to blow all our points on Rachel's. She had her own points that she had been saving up and had a few more days to push for more, but we were returning to Earth in under 4 days. Felt weird to think that in just under 4 days we would be back home. After everything we had been through, it didn't seem right somehow. 90 days passed in the blink of an eye, and it felt like only yesterday we were getting inducted into this new system. Without anything left to do, I decided a change of plans was in order. Instead of waiting for the wave to come to me tomorrow, I would go have a workout fighting a few of the pylons on my way back north. It wouldn't make it easier to conquer since more would fill back in after I left, but we might just be able to get Rachel a dragon bloodline yet. Defend your claim. Wave start, 0:59. I heard the ding for what would be the last time. No more waves would come after this one. No longer would we be forced to fight for our lives every 3 days. We knew that cities had waves like this, but they weren't nearly as frequent as the tutorials had been. They would come once a month and sometimes not even that frequent. It was a hotly debated topic based on the information we had on city ownership and something I took a keen interest in giving my intentions. While everyone had the ability to buy a civilization pylon from the store if they had sufficient coin, that didn't mean everyone was able to found a city. When someone founds a city, the surrounding land gets claimed by the pylon when it is placed. Similar to what happened when we claimed a pylon in the beginning. It was like owning a deed to the land the pylon claims, and the leader obtains that deed. No other pylon would be able to claim the land that another pylon had ownership of unless it was from the same faction. Pylons placed under the ownership of another were called subordinate pylons. If one pylon claimed a vast swath of land from being leveled up a few times, another pylon was able to be placed inside that radius if it was owned by the same person or faction that held ownership the first one, creating a village or town that was tied to the original city, owned by the same people. It was how kingdoms set up their land and what brought about the noble hierarchy that the system used. That was a whole different can of worms that I didn't want to open. I didn't want to be king or start an empire. Just one city was enough for me. A heavily fortified and defensible city, but a city nonetheless. I could let other people have the fun of starting kingdoms and fighting each other for land. I would be able to stay isolated up north and maintain neutrality. A don't mess with me stance. Or that was what I hoped. There might come a time later when I had a few subordinate pylons, but that would be a long ways off. The subordinate pylons would never be able to grow past a certain rank though. They would be capped by the level of the first pylon. If the first rose to city level, then the subordinate pylons would be able to go to town level. There was also a cap on how many subordinate pylons one could have. A city couldn't have countless towns and villages under its control and could only have a few of each. The only other way to conquer land was fighting for pylons in battle. The rules on placing pylons and claiming land kept people from placing them too close together or claiming land that others already held ownership of, which caused fights for land to happen more often. If land was already claimed, you could only gain it by fighting for it. Now, placing a pylon was all well and good, but the system didn't want just anyone to own a city. It sent tests to make sure the owner was of sufficient strength to own it. Those tests came in a few different forms, but they were similar to what we had faced with the waves. It was the system's way of making sure millions of cities didn't pop up by making people earn the right to own one. Similar to the reason we had to fight off a wave to upgrade our pylons to the next rank. The system was full of fun little tests like that. And that was all only for planetary city structure and planetary nobles. There was a whole other level above that going as far as galactic scale. High-tiered people weren't satisfied with only holding ownership of a planet. They needed more. Planetary bodies and galactic sectors of ownership were common in the multiverse with their own set of noble titles. Calling someone a planetary duke instead of a galactic duke was a grave insult and could be punishable by death in some duchies. I didn't get much more time to ruminate on that whole jumble of problematic societal structure as the countdown reached its end. A wave of monsters spawned in for the last time. Chapter 124's Wahelios. It was always fun smashing around the beasts of the wave, but this one was going to be different. I could feel it. The difficulty level was in for a sharp incline, but I didn't think it would be out of my reach. All the different paths of power that I had stepped down added up to a substantial differential between the beasts and me. It was a divide between normal earranks and ones who had stepped down every avenue. Well, almost every avenue. At least that was what I thought before the wave started. What ended up spawning in created an oppressiveness that closed in from all sides surrounding the camp. A weight that started to close in on me. Even from as far away as I was, the feeling was clear. I was in for a fight, a bloody one. The sun was high in the sky, casting light down without a cloud intercept it. Yet it somehow managed to get brighter than before. The light got so bright I had to squint to make anything out. The monsters were somehow producing it, and it was focused on the walls lining the camp, creating a nasty glare that I had to shield my eyes from. With a bit of maneuvering, I managed to get an identify C on one of the leading monsters, and I was finally able to see what I was up against. Wahelios, level 50. They looked like avian velociraptors. Well, more avian than normal velociraptors. The birds reached my chest in height, but they were longer than they were tall. Bird-like beaks protruded out of their head with sharp spikes of teeth jutting out of their mouth. Feathers led down their short arms and ended at their pointy elbows, accentuating the corner. Taloned feet thundered on the ground as the hundreds of Wahelios closed in. Their tails counterbalanced them, letting them run upright on two legs, and were thick in both muscles and feathers. Now that I was in E-rank myself, the level and name of the monsters were no longer blurred or filled with question marks. The rank difference not being there let me see what was approaching clearly with the skill. That was something I had meant to change but never had the time to get around to it. Upgrading the rarity of my Identify C skill would let me see more information than what I was being given and wouldn't fail when there was a high-level difference. Some upgrades even gave insight into the stats of the thing being identified. Some went broader and gave more detail about what the thing was, while others gave deeper insight into the skills a beast had. There were a bunch of different variations that Identify could upgrade into, but I hadn't gotten around to doing it yet. The same was true for picking up an Identify block skill. While we were still in the tutorial, I hadn't thought it was necessary. I knew, roughly, the people that were in here with me and what strength they held, and they knew mine. It wasn't worth it to buy the blocker when Tracy had already seen what I was capable of. Plus, not being the highest level inside the tutorial worked to my advantage. I didn't know if it worked or not, but seeing my level being stuck at 50 might have made people underestimate me. They would have had to have been ignorant of who I was, but it was still a possibility. With us returning to Earth soon, getting a blocker was something I needed to do. Giving information to people for free wasn't something I wanted to do. Best case scenario, I got one so strong no one would be able to see anything. I didn't hold my breath for that though. For every strong Identify block skill, there was an equally strong Identify to pierce it. It was the nature of skills. If one got stronger, the other would have to get stronger to keep up. The monsters didn't care about my Identify predicament and closed in regardless. Javelins of ice met them when they got in range and kicked things into motion. The avalanche was building. The oppressive weight that the monsters carried with them followed them as they neared. It tickled the back of my neck, making my hair stand up. It was a different feeling than what being outmatched felt like, but it was close to it. Usually, when this feeling came about, it was because of a boss or a monster significantly higher level than me. The level difference had a weight to it. The difference in the essence between us. That wasn't true this time. These were level 50 beasts the same as I was. The reason they had such a weight to them was because the tutorial wasn't done trying to kill us yet. It threw one last thing at us as a final send-off. I picked up on it as the rolling wave of might tried to force me down. Every one of the monsters running my way carried a law with them. All of them had leased laws of light. The laws they had added together, rising on top of each other, creating a wall of force that built on my shoulders, pressing me into the ground from their collective weight. The tutorial could have been nice and had them capped at level 50 without having a law, but that would be too easy. That wasn't fit for the grand finale. Even with the surprise of all of the monsters having laws, I didn't think that was the end of it. There would probably be a few more surprises headed my way before the wave was over. The death throes of trying to kill us one last time. So be it. My new hammer twirled in front of me in preparation. A flourish I had come to like while wielding the heavy weapon. Up and around before smashing into the ground next to my feet. It was both showboating and a provocation. Not that the beasts knew that, but it wasn't for them. It was for me. The tide reached me and I started swinging. My hammer rose and fell as more beasts joined the fray. The monsters were falling, but not as fast as more joined in. Their numbers kept rising even as the crushed and deformed dead rose with them. It was endless and unstoppable. The pressure inside me built, and I couldn't help but feel the heat of battle in my soul. The song being sung inside me built into a rising crescendo. The pressure reached new heights as shafts of light pierced through me, searing through my armor. Blood leaked from the seared holes before freezing over with ice. My armor wasn't enough to block them. It was the same reason fighting Austin was so annoying. The beasts were able to get through my armor with their light-based attacks. The ice only blunted the worst of it before the rest made it through. My law and mana couldn't hold up to the onslaught of hundreds of attacks all backed with a law. I could handle one or two, maybe even a few, but not the amount that was being leveraged against me. While I focused on swinging my hammer, the law reinforcement on my armor was worn through by cascading beams of light before the rest smashed through and into my flesh. Frozen patchwork worked overtime to freeze the holes that were burned through me. Through it all, my hammer rose and fell, sweeping arcs in front of me when more joined in. It was an all-out battle, and I didn't even have time to cast magic. I couldn't bear the distraction from the melee I was in to launch any ice arrows. Snow revolved around me faster and faster in an attempt to ease the fight, but more of it began to shatter from the oppressive light. Sweeping snow did what it could, but the tide of beasts overwhelmed the newly upgraded skill. Mana flowed through my hammer, building up ice atop the end until it tripled in size. The massive clump whipped through the air like a maul, taking numerous beasts with it until the end of its arc. Before the momentum of the head could end, shatter sent the extra ice exploding out, taking yet more foes with it to the grave and returning my hammer to its original state. My hammer came back through for another pass with the spike leading this time, stacking bodies atop its length before the force died out. My swings increased in intensity as the avalanche built behind me, rise and fall, up and down. The rhythmic swings felled the beasts as fast as I could. Icy bastion bloomed around me as I felt a strong light beam close in. It had the strength of more than a few of the monsters combined into a concentrated lance. They were adding their skills together, concentrating the light and layering their attacks on top of each other to get through my guard. Yet another unwanted surprise. Reinforced body, wasn't enough to stop the lance from piercing through me the first time it happened, and I threw an icy bastion, when I felt it coming the second time. With frozen patchwork, my body could take a beating, but I burned a bit of mana to save me from the wound. While the skill could patch me up, deflecting the blow with a bit of mana was better. The attacks against me built as I did what I could to ward them off. Ice shattered from claw and talon around me before launching out into the sea of bodies. Any of my ice that was broken by enemies turned into a projectile for me to use. both ice manipulation, and throwing proficiency, applied to the shards of ice before they slunked into their waiting partners. Righteous fury ignited and burned inside me as I couldn't hold off not using the skill any longer. If I tried to save it for the boss, I wasn't sure I would make it through the wave. Hundreds of least laws added up, worming their way through my guard. Their collective might was enough to stomp down on me, pushing my domain back, making me either wade through the thick hostile atmosphere or spend more mana to keep my domain secure. The Frost rune tried to fight back, but it wasn't enough against the horde of monsters. The rune wasn't made to fight against that kind of force. Permafrost, helped keep the space steady, but it only worked on the area closest to me. The ice lining the inside of the walls already starting to melt, the heat building from the focus light too much for it to handle. Throughout it all, the avalanche built. Grunts of pain were fought through along with the wounds building on my body. My body showed its might for the first time, and I couldn't help but marvel at what it had turned into. Body of wood was more than what I gave it credit for. Attacks that would have cleaved flesh from my bones were turned into nicks that barely drew blood. Piercing beams of light that would have burrowed clean through me only penetrated a few inches deep. Seeing how my body stopped most attacks cold was the reason they began to combine their power. The concentrated beams of tens of monsters were enough to pierce through me, even with my refined body. My spirit began to infuse me, and the fight escalated yet again. During the waves, I usually adhered to a continuous escalation of power, starting with avalanche using my law and spirit sparingly, and saving my bloodline and fury for the boss. This wave wasn't allowing me to do that. It was making me burn hot and fast to last through the throngs of lesser monsters. Everything was coming out as the pressure mounted. My fury was burning inside me. My law and spirit infused my attacks and body. The only thing that I had held back was my bloodline. If there was one thing I wanted to save for the boss, it was that, ever since I evolved, my bloodline took on a new life. Having the heart of a frost giant turned the bloodline from a decent power boost into a devastating jump in power. My heart amplified the powers of my bloodline by a significant degree, and I was able to use more of it than I had before, like jumping from low to high-octane fuel. The only problem was the length of time I could call upon it shortened to compensate. It was a trade-off between a bigger boost in power for a shorter period of time. As the last of the Zwahilios clawed and fought their way through the gates, finally letting me see the light at the end of the tunnel, it was time to do so. I almost felt bad for the little light-blasting shits. Without the need to hold my bloodline in reserve any longer, I called on the power buried deep in my core. Ice spread through my veins and my muscles bulged as they tried to contain the boost in strength. While my heart could output more power, my muscles struggled to contain it. Without having a body of wood, my muscles would have popped like a grotesque balloon from the strain. I was sure that the physical manifestations of my bloodline were more pronounced, but without anyone else here to tell me, I wasn't sure the form they took. All I could hope was that I didn't start glowing. Chapter 125, End. Austin. Point of view. He could feel the light law the beasts had resonating with his own. His attacks were being bent by the monsters as they closed in, going where he hadn't intended for them to land. It was frustrating not to have them go where he wanted them to, but the deviation wasn't much. A few inches here and there at most, but that changed a lot when the things he was aiming for required precision. His attacks were aimed with pinpoint accuracy at weak points, and the deviation affected that. In between ribs to penetrate deep into the chest cavity, through the eye socket for easy access to the brain without having to punch through the skull. While a nudge here and there wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, it threw off his attacks mightily. Also, it came at a time when he needed to be at his best. The final wave was proving more difficult than any had anticipated, and he wasn't like Chris. He couldn't solo waves and stay on his feet through brutal injuries. Austin saw what Chris walked away from on a daily basis and still wondered how he managed to keep going. If Austin got even half as damaged as Chris, he would be down for the count, needing a healer to put him back together. While his vitality was higher than the icy juggernauts, his fortitude wasn't. The point of all of his agility was to not get hit in the first place. He could afford to have a lower fortitude if he dodged more attacks than what landed on him. Austin's eyes sharpened as he pulled on his bloodline. He had been experimenting with its use, and he realized that short bursts were best. Whenever he was about to get overwhelmed or he needed to kill the beasts around him quickly, it conserved most of the energy and he could use it over a longer period of time. His speed soared and his spear shot out, piercing through the monsters around him in quick succession. The rest of the family was getting battered by the beasts, but nothing too serious had occurred. The gate wasn't able to hold up for long, only rewarding them precious minutes to attack with abandon. The time for full-on battle had come. Austin's family showed their experience from previous waves and dealt with it in a calm and collected manner. The warriors were veterans by this point and took up their place at the front, placing their full trust in the backline to see them through the battle. Austin didn't even want to think about how Tracy's sides were doing. They were wholly unprepared for what was about to happen. They placed their full trust in the walls and defenses they had built, and now those defenses were crumbling, falling apart under the might of nearly 1,000 least laws the beasts carried. He was surprised the gate lasted as long as it did, honestly. Even with all of the explosions and elemental attacks launched from the top of the wall, monsters sprouted from nothing to continue the advance, biting and clawing at the gate to get through. Taking one down did little to stop the tide. Even with all the traps laid scattered in front of the wall, it wasn't enough. It was never going to be, but Austin couldn't help but imagine the despondent faces of Tracy's members right now. He knew they placed too much trust in their defenses. They didn't have the experience of fighting in the thick of it like his family. They weren't ready for the battle that had started inside the walls. They were weak. It was what he had been trying to push Chris for in the beginning. Austin wanted to push his family just as much as himself, but he hadn't gone through with it. Maybe if he had, there would be more of them still here today. Or more of them would have died during the fight with the Mindbreaker. There were no absolutes with what-ifs, but Austin couldn't help but regret his decision. He knew Chris did, even though he didn't like to talk about it. Chris was bottling up everything that had happened, and he wasn't in for a good time when that seal finally cracked. He kept trying to put one foot in front of the other, and he would eventually falter because of it. Going from pressing concern to pressing concern couldn't last forever. When Austin had tried to broach the subject with him, all Chris would say was, "I will deal with it when I find the time." Austin couldn't help but pity the person that made him finally explode. Chris. Point of view. Oh! A primal roar escaped me as more and more blood leaked out of me. My fighting had become more savage as the wave continued, and I couldn't help but shout in frustration. It wasn't even because of the beasts anymore. It was me yelling at the world. As the beams of light kept finding their way through my armor, more of my mana flowed through me to intensify my attacks. Sweeping snow revolved around me, nearly turning the sky white as I pumped rivers of mana through it. My law and spirit flowed liberally into all the ice and snow in the area. My hammer whizzed through the air, trying to keep up with the last of the monsters. The end of the wave was coming, and I was gearing up to meet it. The floodgates were opened, and I could feel the mental strain building from using my law like I was. When I said all the ice in the area, I meant all. It flowed into every snowflake and speck of broken ice around me as I flooded the area in its might. My spirit did the same, and I could feel its power reservoir falling at a commensurate rate. Same with my mana, keeping all of my skills active. If I hadn't seen the end of the tide working its way through the gate, this would have been suicide. Draining myself like this would leave me high and dry when the boss showed up. But I could last long enough now that the end was in sight. The increased brutality added to the drops of blood flying through the air. The beasts were fast and nimble, but they were not very durable. A hammer blow was enough to end them if I hit the right spot. A therapist would probably say that I was projecting, but I couldn't give a rat's ass about their opinion right now. My increase in brutality was perfectly justified. These were the monsters sent to kill us every wave. These were the beasts sent to challenge us and stand in the way of our return to Earth. The tutorial that was supposed to ease us into this whole process. The system that uprooted our life and sequestered us into this hell. My life that had turned upside down on a random Saturday in March. This wasn't how my life was supposed to go. I didn't plan to wade through the blood of thousands. smashing down monsters and snuffing out lives with my hammer. I wanted to be an engineer, get a cushy job somewhere and retire early. Maybe start a family in a few years while watching my niece and nephew grow up. Teach them cuss words and buy them beer after they turned 18. Not this. My hammer caved in the skull of another monster, showering me in brain matter and blood. Little chunks of skull rained down around me, and it was hard not to be frustrated at what I was made to do. What the world had made me do. The killing would never end. It wasn't the way the world worked now that there were levels and essence. I would never be free of it, never get the chance to live a peaceful life. It made me angry. Angry about the choice that had been taken from me. The option that was removed from my future. And what made me the angriest? What made me seethe with rage? I liked it. Maybe some of my frustrations were at myself. At the person that I had become now that I had a hammer in my hands. At the person that had died and been reborn 88 days ago. At the person my father would barely recognize. So much anger was bottled up inside me, there was enough of it to go around. All of my regrets flashed through my mind, and it was hard not to be angry at myself. At the stupid choices made along the way. If I had started slaughtering beasts at the start, would more of my family still be alive? If I went and massacred every human in the tutorial, would my family be intact? Maybe the chilling death of Helheim was who I was. Maybe it was through the blood of thousands that I would rise. Maybe it was just my grief. Gah! I chose not to contain it anymore. To stop repressing the emotions inside of me. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to deal with what was in there. I wanted it to go away. It wasn't the anger at myself that I drew on. It was my fury at the circumstance I was forced into. I couldn't fight the system or the tutorial grounds I was in. But I could kill the beasts. Unfiltered rage flowed through me, and I swung. And swung and swung and swung. At some point I started screaming as I brought my hammer down, bringing death to another being. Smashing the thing that blocked our exit out of here. Even as the last of the lesser monsters were ground into the dirt, I didn't stop swinging. I charged the 4 bosses who tried to impose their aura on me. Charged at them with abandon and swung. The beast didn't go down with the first blow, so I did it again. And again. It finally died, making me move on to the next one. There was no grace in my swings, only destruction. My body wasn't handling the punishment I was making it go through, but that didn't matter to me right now. Maybe it was the tiny part of me that wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. The part that wanted to take them down with me. The part that didn't want to be here anymore. I wasn't sure of the reason, but I was sure of the outcome. They would meet my hammer and they would die. My mind went blank and I let go of everything else. Of everything except for one thing. My desire to kill the things that had ruined my life. With single-minded purpose, I swung. And I swung. And I swung. And I swung. The boss showed up, but I didn't change in my approach. My hammer came alight with the powers flowing through it and almost matched the preceding beast's luminescence in intensity. The boss felt different, like it was stronger than it should have been, but that flowed through my head like water on a duck's back. In one ear and out the other. It didn't change anything. The only sounds that rang out from inside the camp were my guttural screaming and the squelch of flesh being pounded in. Booming thuds upon flesh as liquids splattered outward. Of repeated pounding almost incessant in pace. Thud, 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 thud. The thuds lessened until they became dull, then changed further before finally turning into squelches. It wasn't until I couldn't physically lift my hammer that I stopped. The failure to lift it was the only indicator that I shouldn't continue. My mind came back to me slowly and I took in the scenery around me. Bodies littered the area in various states, with the biggest one lying in front of me. My body was screaming at me in protest to rest, and there were more holes in me than Swiss cheese. The 4 mini-bosses were easy to spot because of their size difference. They too were smashed beyond recognition. But the one that was by far the worst was the boss. It was little more than a mangled lump of flesh at this point, smashed beyond all recognition. I couldn't even point out the different parts of the body, it was so disfigured. It was easy to see that I snapped. The level of destruction was unnecessary even against monsters. The entire boss was unusable after the treatment I put it through. Blood saturated my armor, and the frozen blood upon it looked purposeful in its intensity. The crimson layer evenly distributed throughout my form. I just stood and stared at what I had done. The realization that the tutorial was over didn't hit until a few moments later. With everything that I had been through, of the trial that my family had been put through, it wasn't relief I was feeling at the end of it. Without a better way to process, I sat and cried. Cried for the people who weren't here and the things that I had done. Of the people I had killed and the blood that I had reaped. Of the empty feeling inside me. I cried. Chapter 126, Closing Hours. Picking myself up took longer than I cared to admit. It was more than just my body I had to put back together. I had prepared for injuries, though, and potions to help with healing my outburst. Not so much. Healing potions were stashed inside the keep to use, and I had a few on me for emergencies. I had to keep a few stashed to make sure not all of them broke if I got pummeled a little too hard. If I kept all of them on me like I did for the vine bears, there was the possibility of them breaking. These healing potions were a bit better than normal because I anticipated needing a decently sized pick-me-up. Plus, we had plans starting not long from now that I needed to be fighting fit for. I bought some of the more expensive materials for Connor to use, and he managed to brew a batch of peak-grade Commentator healing potions out of them. They worked significantly better than the generic ones we bought from the store. The pylons wouldn't conquer themselves, and my body needed stitching back together. Ice wouldn't hold it together forever. Still, I took a bit of extra time to get myself in order before meeting up with everyone. I wasn't sure how well they would have handled the wave, but I didn't fear for their safety. After feeling the wave for myself, I was confident that they would be fine. Jonathan and Austin together would be able to dull a lot of the force, and the rest were strong enough to handle the leftovers. Only having to fight one wall worth also helped matters. Tracy and the new group, on the other hand, would probably have casualties depending on how well they did. I suspected Tracy's group lost quite a few. They weren't on the same level as us in terms of strength. Both in levels and experience fighting, which would hurt them when it came down to it. They weren't prepared for what was going to happen. Limping back down south gave me the answer I was looking for. 16 faces met me halfway into my journey, and I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. Even though I expected to see them, I couldn't help but hold doubts. It was hard not to worry, even when I knew they weren't weak. "It's good to see you," I huffed at them. Abigail came up to me with glowing hands to start the healing. It was as bad as we thought. The other healers came up to add their skills to the bowl as I turned, and we headed back up north. Abigail and the other healers worked to fix me up and make me a little less holy, while everyone else started walking back to our camp. It was a bit of a waste for me to turn around and walk back to where I started, but it saved time in the long run. Giving the healers time to work through all of the wounds I had endured before we kicked our plan into motion. "How did they fare?" I asked. Tracy's camp lost 22 people. The eastern wall fared the worst and had the most deaths of the wave. Kurt, the newcomer, lost 5 defending the southern wall. Tracy losing that many was surprising. I knew they wouldn't handle the last wave very well, but that number was still higher than I thought it would be. "Why so many?" I questioned. "There was some collateral damage," she said cryptically. She looked around to make sure none of the kids were in range before continuing with a quieter voice. "Some of the explosions and traps went off when people were still fighting at the gate. I wasn't able to see all of it, but it looked like she went scorched earth when the gates fell, even though people were still there fighting. With everything that had happened, that wasn't all that surprising. The type of person Tracy presented herself as in my head wasn't someone above doing something like that. She didn't have an attachment to the people in her camp like I did. She didn't really care if they lived or died. She only cared about living through the tutorial, and she got her wish. It was a distasteful thing to do, but not all that shocking. It made what I was about to do easier, at least. Tutorial end. 01:19:32:43. One of the first things we needed to do was allocate the next 44 hours. We already had plans set up, but now we knew for certain how much time we had left and could draw up a timeline. The wave and subsequent healing, along with travel time, took 4 hours, giving us just under 2 days to conquer as many pylons as possible. We didn't even plan to get all 50, as that was unfeasible. We had estimates we had come up with, but those were just guesses at how many we would get. The teams were planned out and we had all prepared for the coming hours. Austin and I would go out alone together. Rachel, Jonathan, and Hal would go together. Carrie formed a team with a few other family members and the rest stayed at the camp. They needed to watch the kids and keep hold of our camp. Abigail was one of the people who stayed behind as well to coordinate and keep track of the points coming in. We needed to buy a few last-minute things before the timer ran out and she would be able to message me if anything came up. It wouldn't do to have Tracy or Kurt try something while we were out. I almost wanted it to happen just to have an excuse. "You ready, buddy?" I asked to my partner for the coming days. "Woo, can't wait." His flatline tone and dripping sarcasm weren't enough to get him out of it. All the fighting was going to be tiring, but it was something we needed to do. "Let's go then." We fought and fought, well past sundown and late into the night. Austin's skills were nice for being able to see without the sun, and his nightlight powers were getting better, even if he didn't like me calling them that. We got 4 pylons before we called it a night, which was a decent haul for the time we spent. Austin was slagging by the end and I wasn't much better. He didn't have the sun to give him strength and my outburst took more out of me than I thought. The next day we managed to get 8 more. Austin was a lot more powerful during the day and we grew more experienced with the monsters we were fighting. We understood their tactics and habits after fighting them for nearly 32 hours straight. We didn't sleep that night, fighting throughout as we were leaving the tutorial at noon the following day. We didn't have that much time left and I wanted to squeeze every last drop of effort out of it as I could. Throughout the night we only got 3 more before the sun came up. Both tiredness and being out of steam played a role in our stalling effort. The sun crept along its path in the sky and it was time for me to depart. All told, Austin and I fought and conquered 19 pylons. 19 out of 50 for just the 2 of us wasn't that bad. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to," Austin said, knowing I wasn't thrilled with what we had planned. "Getting cold feet now? It was your idea." Even my half-hearted chuckle managed to sound unenthused about the course I was on. I had tossed and turned about the idea, and no matter how I thought about it, I didn't like it. Even though I didn't like it, I would do it anyway. Tracy doing what she had eased my conscience, but not enough to be comfortable with it. "Have fun with the rest of them," my parting words said. I marched back to camp. There were a few things I needed before heading to my final destination. Tutorial end. 00:02:03:34. The timer ticking down added to the suspense and the closing hours were upon us. Abigail gave me a once-over as I walked into camp, making sure I was fighting fit. "How many did you get?" She asked for the number even before any healing flowed through me. Not even a hello? "How are you doing, Christopher?" "Oh, I'm fine. How are you?" She gave me a flat look until I gave her the information she wanted. "We got 19. She was unfazed by the number, which hurt my feelings a little, and barreled on without comment. "John managed to get 11 so far, and they're out trying to get another before the time's up. Everything is packed and ready to go. All we have left is for you to give me your points." Everyone was using Abigail as a bank for points so that we could get a quick total for how many we had. On every trip to camp, Austin and I dropped our points on her and the others were doing the same. I handed over the points from the last few pylons and couldn't help but startle at the total we had managed to accumulate. The pylons rewarded nearly 1 million a pop, making Austin and I rake in nearly 10 million points each from the 19 we conquered. The others conquering 11 meant another 11 million would be added to that total. Overall, with the points we had saved up and the haul we had managed to pull in, Abigail was most likely the richest person in the tutorial right now. What does that bring us to? I knew roughly what the number was, but it never hurt to hear it out loud. Austin hasn't been back to give me his share, and John and them still have a pool to give me, she said, dragging it out. But I have over 40 million right now. Is that enough for everyone? We need, 11 more? Her nod confirmed that 11 people still needed a bloodline. We have enough for the bloodline essence, but not enough to buy all the materials people want. Some might have to make do with a less expensive part or a lesser tier. I mulled over that information and nodded. That sounded about right. We would be able to get everyone a bloodline, but wouldn't be able to get the parts for everyone. We hoped that they would be able to get them as prizes for the tutorial if we didn't make enough for everyone and had plans for the occasion we didn't make enough. Do you think she will be able to do it? The she I was talking about was Rachel. She had been fighting non-stop trying to get enough points for the bloodline she wanted. She got less sleep than even I did as fires raged through the night. I don't know. Abigail shrugged. She hasn't been back in a while, so I don't know how many she has. John tried to get her to slow down, but she refused. I wouldn't be surprised if she passes out from exhaustion after the time is up. At least she was persistent. We went over a few more things until the conversation ground down. The timer was ticking down, and I lingered for probably longer than I should have. You know you don't have to do this if you don't want to, Abigail said. Couldn't help but chuckle at that. What? What's funny? She asked, confused. Nothing. It's just the second time I've heard that today. With nothing left to say, I began my march down south for the last time. Everything was packed up and everything I wanted to take with me was accounted for. I wouldn't be taking anything with me during my trip, but the others would make sure everything made it back. I didn't have a lot of things that I wanted to take, but there were a few that stood out. I was wearing my armor, and the only other things I wanted to keep were my tools. The blacksmithing tools I had made were something I would take with me. I could make them again, but why waste them? Plus, some of the trophies I wanted to keep. The pelt of the vine bear especially. We didn't know how our stuff was going to work, but we assumed anything being carried would be transported with us. We had Sam and Ashley make up a few backpacks for us to store everything in and to make it easier to carry. Mine was already packed and ready to go. With nothing else to delay myself with, it was time to do something less than honorable. I'm sorry, Dad. Chapter 127, When Words Fail. Tracy. Point of view. She felt it before she saw it. Since the last wave finished, every bird that Kathy had sent north was killed indiscriminately. Arrows of ice, spears of light, or balls of fire killed anything that got close to what their camp was doing. Her eye in the sky was blind, and she wasn't warned of his approach. She knew what was coming. It was hard not to after she had met the man. The way the northern faction exited her camp left little doubt. The only reason to depart as quickly and as orderly as they had was because of only a few reasons, and all of them were bad. Only minutes after the wave ended they were up and out of here with pre-packed luggage. She could honestly say she saw this coming. Tracy thought it would be Kurt first rather than Christopher, but knew one of them would probably do it. She was wrong on who it would be. The slight chill in the air gave away who it was that approached her camp, and the accompanied dread was unmistakable. Her control over the camp was already slipping, and she was barely holding on by this point. She didn't hold the same power she once did. There weren't enough people that would stand with her this time. Even if she still had that kind of power, she wasn't certain it would have worked. After the last wave ended, no one wanted to give up their points anymore. They didn't want to live by her rules, and they refused to listen to her. The threat to their lives was over, and they expressed their discontent with the way they had been treated. Some left. Others stayed, but they wouldn't cooperate with her. Most refused her outright, staying only to use the facilities that Tracy had built during the tutorial before they were whisked away and back to Earth. Without the influx of points, she had to go out and earn them herself. Kathy stayed with her, and she cut a deal with Damien to keep some muscle on her side. But she didn't trust the rest of her camp enough to keep them close. She had to offer outrageous rewards for people to go out and conquer pylons under her faction. Most scoffed when she began to ask for their support, but some were willing to listen. Unable to ignore what she was offering so quickly, she only managed to get 5 other pylons in the last few days, which was less than she wanted. None of her camp had the motivation to charge into battle after they had just been freed from the torment, which left her with fewer pylons than she predicted. Added to her original pylon that still stood, she had 6 total. Without birds to keep track of everything in the north, she didn't know how many the freak of nature was able to take over. His family was nearly as strong as he was, and they all were starting to become freaks of nature. She saw the looks of distaste at her before they left. The unconcealed faces of disapproval. It had started ever since she refused to help them with the mindbreaker. Tracy had felt the shift inside her camp after that. They came back a few members short and barely spoke with her anymore. Their representative, Abigail, would only engage in the bare necessities before ending contact. It was clear where the rift had started. All of the signs pointed to this happening, but there was nothing Tracy could do to stop it. She had spent all of the points she had acquired on trying to survive the final wave and didn't have the major income that usually came after a wave. All she had left was the points she earned from fighting nearby pylons, and they weren't enough to stop what was coming. She had watched as the man who closed in on her camp demolished waves on his own, and was under no delusion that she could contend with that. She could only hope that he wasn't out for blood. She had seen the outcome of that movie before, and it ended with an exploded head. While Tracy could say that she had seen this coming, she could also say a part of her was surprised. During her conversations with the man, as brief as their contact was, he didn't seem the type to go down this road. He seemed more like the stoic type that would abstain from doing something like this. The light show with the spear, though, he had something like this written on his face. If it was him coming down here, she would understand. She wouldn't be able to defend against him either, but at least it wouldn't be out of character. Still, she wasn't going to roll over and give up all her hard work. She had traps planted the second the wave was over, specifically designed for humans instead of monsters. She bought a few materials with what little points she had left that targeted ice powers specifically. If she was going down, she was going down fighting. The rising sense of dread signaled the distance closing. The temperature began dropping faster, and everyone inside the camp noticed the change. Not all of them had seen the man fight and hadn't put the two together yet. They didn't know the force of nature that was coming and were blissfully unaware. She didn't have enough points to repair the gates after the wave and had to settle for some of the builders doing less than stellar repairs. She lamented her lack of points once more at that thought. Those repairs weren't going to be enough. They weren't going to hold out long against the kind of force she had seen him deploy. While she had traps armed and a few consumables for such an occasion stashed away, she didn't think she was going to win. The best she could do was delay until the timer was up. Tutorial end. 00:00:47:56. Christopher was cutting it close. Only 47 minutes until the tutorial ended, and the man was only just now arriving. He was either too busy to come sooner or confident he could finish it in the time they had left. One of the other mages that she had paid to stay started casting a two-way scrying pool, the same as the first time they had spoken. If she was going to delay as long as she could, fighting wasn't going to be her first option. Maybe she could get him to change his mind. The portal snapped up without resistance, and she saw the hulking form of chiseled ice wading through the jungle. He wasn't in a rush and walked almost leisurely toward her northern wall. The portal moved to keep pace, only bobbing slightly from the motion. "Christopher," Tracy greeted. The man's gait didn't falter as he took off his helmet of ice. Well, less taking off and more letting it fade away. "Tracy," he returned. There was a tightness in his face that was new, and she saw the barest hints of hesitation in his motion. He stopped for only a brief second before continuing his march when he saw the portal keeping pace. "So it has come to this?" Tracy didn't mince words. Over the short time she had known him, she knew this was the best way to get him to speak. His audible sigh told her more than he probably intended. The resignation and unwillingness were clear. All of the signs kept pointing at him not wanting to do this. Even more questions bloomed in Tracy's mind. "I am sorry," he said softly. "I have given this extensive thought and contemplation and have come up with what I think is reasonable. I am not here to kill you or take your points. That's going too far in my opinion. You've earned those, and me taking those away would cross a line I am unwilling to cross." Him not being here to kill her eased most of Tracy's worries. She didn't think he would do something like that, but it took a weight off her shoulders to hear him say it. "I am also not here to take your pylon away from you. You've defended it successfully through 30 waves, and it is not my intention to take it from you like that." Hearing that made her stiffen. If he wasn't here to kill her and he wasn't here to take her pylon, what was he here for? Revenge? Tracy hadn't done anything that would call for revenge. But his words jarred her back to attention. "To get the most out of this tutorial and the prizes that will be given out at the end, I need to do the most I possibly can. All I ask is that you subordinate your faction to mine." He paused to let her mull over his request. It is what I feel comfortable asking without going too far in my opinion. You get to keep control of your pylons and points while I get a bit better of a reward having a subordinate faction with pylons under their control. In the grand scheme of things, I think what I'm asking for is fair. We helped tremendously during the waves and asking for this doesn't seem like too much. He stated. Subordinate? That was the reason that he came all the way down here? He brought down a mountain of dread on her head only to ask for her to bend the knee. It was ridiculous. If she had the power that Christopher wielded, she would be asking for a lot more than just subordination. She had already exploited the southern camp with subordination, and he was in a better position than she was when she did it. The southern camp was going to fall during the last wave, and all of them knew it. Their camp wasn't able to hold up to the monsters of the 27th wave, and they were bleeding people trying to hold on. Her repeated attempts at getting them to merge were initially ignored until people started to die. They lost over 15 people before they eventually said yes. The only holdout was their leader, who found her terms were too much. Subordination was too far, and he wasn't willing to give in. He eventually agreed only because the rest of his camp convinced him. They saw the writing on the wall and managed to sway him into saying yes. Tracy was certain they would have died to the last wave if they stood alone. The only reason that she hadn't insisted on the same thing for Christopher's camp was because she needed them more than they needed her. Plus, she was positive they would have said no if she insisted on that point. Tracy wasn't sure that she would have been able to survive without them holding a wall for her for as long as they did. She only had to focus on 3 directions of attack instead of all 4, and it took a load off of her that was desperately needed. Her traps were more concentrated on the other 3 gates, and her forces were able to deal with the waves easier. It also allowed her to start banking points for later waves rather than spend everything as she earned it. Without them defending a wall, things would have ended a lot differently. It was closer than she would have liked already, and that was with the 2 other factions helping, letting her limp over the finish line mostly unscathed. Subordination wasn't that bad, all things considered, but she didn't want to roll over so easily. And if I say no, what will you do then? She pushed back. Poking the bear wasn't what she had in mind when this conversation started, but she wasn't going to give in so easily. The few minutes of back and forth since the conversation started had taken enough time for Christopher to reach the edge of the jungle. He was standing in clear view of her camp now and finally came to a halt. Her question was left unanswered for an uncomfortable amount of time while he stood looking over her camp. He no doubt saw the repairs to the gates she had made and was evaluating the state of the defenses. I asked myself the same thing, he said slowly. How far I was willing to go for this? It wasn't even my idea in the first place. Tracy jumped on the weakness she saw. Any way to get out of subordinating her faction she would take. You don't have to go through with it if you don't want to. Her hopes were dashed when emitted a short laugh instead of considering her words. She wanted to ask why he laughed but wasn't given the chance. If not now, then when? He said, I hope to build a city when we get back, and the same problems are going to come up then as they are now. There will be times I must be proactive instead of passive. Times when I must be the aggressor instead of the defender. Being neutral is my goal, but that does not mean I will be passive. There will be things that I have to fight for. Resources people will wish to control and dungeons people will wish to claim. I have read the things that have appeared on Earth. The resources that people will flock to in hopes of leveling up and stepping on the paths of power. He paused before continuing. There will not be a place for pacifism. Remaining passive and non-confrontational will get me nothing. What should I do if someone takes control of something I want? When they have something that will make me or my family stronger and they refuse to sell and deny any trade? He considered for a moment before changing directions. Would you give up your pylon for points? He asked. Tracy shook her head. Would you trade it to me for something I could give you or a favor I would owe you? He asked again. Tracy shook her head once again. What should I do then? He asked. When you have denied to sell and refused other options? The only thing left is to use force, and we both know how that will end. The intensity of his stare as he said that made something inside of her shiver. Sweat began to build on her lower back and goosebumps appeared on her arms. Yes, she knew how that would go. Saying that doesn't mean force will be my first option, hopefully not my second either, but I cannot dismiss the possibility that force will be necessary in some cases when words fail. I have given it a lot of thought and I came up with a process that I feel comfortable with doing. The most honorable way I can think of to go about using force. I will challenge you for it, he said. It took Tracy's brain a second to comprehend what he was saying. When it finally did, she couldn't help but say what instantly came to mind. You'll challenge me for it? Tracy said incredulously. Like a duel? When people used to throw gloves to declare a challenge. Tracy couldn't help it. The thought was absurd. Who challenged people anymore? There were no duels anymore like there were in the past. Well, except in Texas, but mutual combat was different. Yes, like a duel. It is the most honorable way of going about it that I could come up with and the way my dad would find least disappointing. Christopher said softly. There was a moment after he said that when he unstrung the hammer from his back and brought it around in front of him. He gave it a twirl up and around before smashing it into the ground. You've heard my terms. I require an answer, he stated. Tracy looked at the timer and clicked her tongue. There was still too much time on the clock and she wouldn't be able to get out of this. Chapter 128 Curtains Close. Chris. Point of view. Tutorial end. 00:00:25:12. I knew that Tracy was stalling, but I allowed myself the chance to voice my thoughts. I wasn't required to do so, but it felt good to get it off my chest. It was different than discussing it with Austin or Abigail. They were biased to what I had to say. Tracy, though, jumped headfirst into the kind of thinking that was required when back on Earth. Maybe a bit too much for my tastes, but she would see what I was talking about without me having to explain it or justify myself. And if I was reading her expression correctly, she thought I wasn't going far enough with what I was asking for. The initial surprise when I asked for subjugation was hard to miss, along with the glint that arose after hearing it was only that. Like she was looking at her future reward for keeping her pylon. That didn't bother me though. I was asking for what I felt was right. A fair enough compensation that it didn't feel like extortion or stealing, but enough to feel rewarded for the work we put in. We helped with the waves, helped her survive, and now we would be getting something out of it. My challenge also gave her the opportunity to defend herself. As the challenged, she would be able to dictate the kind of battle that would ensue. One-on-one, group, army, it didn't matter much to me, and was left up to what she wanted to do. Refusal was also an option, but at that point, I could say I tried the honorable way first. When Austin first proposed the idea, I wanted nothing to do with it. It was a needless way to make enemies and was ultimately unnecessary. The marginal gain wasn't worth antagonizing her or others in the future. I wanted to build a city without the fighting or wars that most would endure. A way to isolate myself and my family away from the fighting we had been forced to go through. Making enemies was counterproductive to that goal, and antagonizing her would turn her into an enemy for later. Killing her would accomplish the same without making enemies, but I was unwilling to stoop so low. It was only after a lot of thought and consideration that I came around to the idea. The thing that changed my mind, and the reason I proposed what I did, was because of the future. While burying my head in the sand and taking an isolationist policy sounded good, it would eventually lead to problems. If I created my city up north and stood alone without fighting for the things that would make me stronger, others would. Others would fight, claw, and strive for every scrap while I took the slower way, without fighting for things and rising in levels at a more sedate pace. The problems wouldn't show themselves immediately, but over time, they would show up. In 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, what would the power difference be? I had to consider longer stretches of time now that my lifespan had been extended. I wasn't sure of the exact length I would live naturally, but it was close to 200 years now that I was E-rank. Longer if I kept rising in level. If I didn't gain strength at the same rate as others, I wouldn't be able to keep up. If I didn't seek out resources and opportunities and left them alone because of an unwillingness to fight, I would fall behind. My family would fall behind. And after 50 or so years of not keeping pace, what would I do when someone stronger than me, a rank ahead with better gear, came to conquer my city? Came to subjugate what I had built? This new world necessitated conflict, and I couldn't shy away from it. Wouldn't shy away from it. If I did, it would lead to paying fealty to someone else down the line or worse, death. While being under someone and paying fealty to others wasn't a bad thing, generally speaking, it depended on who it was you paid fealty to. It was subject to change and could become someone who was unworthy of it. It was better to not take that chance in the first place and stand on your own 2 feet. To remain independent of anyone else's influence. To do that, to remain independent, I needed to fight at times that required it. To challenge the people who needed it. To gain the resources and opportunity one required to stand on my own. Which was what led me to what I had come up with. I would try words first, buying what I wanted or trading for it. Then, after words failed, I would resort to challenging them. If that didn't work and they refused to entertain that, well, I did my best. I took every step towards a solution that didn't require such lengths and was refused at every turn. After that, what happened wasn't my fault anymore. War was bloody and most often needless, but it still had a place in history for a reason. It was my goal not to resort to that, but sometimes doing something I didn't like was an option I couldn't refuse. It was better than what others would no doubt do. Comparing myself to others wasn't a good way to judge the morality of my actions, but it helped ease my conscience. Made me feel better about the path I had come up with. I could only hope my father didn't disapprove. I didn't think he would, but it was a constant on my mind. After issuing my challenge, Tracy stared at me in contemplation. I had little doubt she was going over everything in her head that she could do, but in the end, I expected her to agree without a fight. At least that was what I hoped. I didn't desire to fight again. I didn't want to fight. Not for a while, really. The timer ticked away and she finally gave an answer. Fine. It was hard not to hear the disappointment in her voice, but she had agreed nonetheless. Without being prompted, she continued, I, Tracy Litterman, leader of the Hoosier faction, do swear fealty to Christopher Zelensky, leader of the Zelensky family. May my pylons and lands be under his, and may my vassals become his. The oath was bare bones, but I didn't need it to be anything more than that. The system took her words and made them true. My status sheet had a few more lines on it and the deal was done. Being in the tutorial changed a few things, and things that would have happened back on Earth didn't. Being subjugated here was only a pylon ownership shift with only a faction hierarchy order change. We didn't have noble ranks or cities to think about. If this were later and back on Earth between 2 cities or kingdoms, there would be a levy paid to me from Tracy. She would pay me some of the taxes she earned along with a few other things related to city governance. There wasn't a tax that the camps were able to collect as we didn't deal in coins, and there wasn't a material tax on dungeons as there were none. Both were missing from our agreement. Usually, a city had a percentage tax that the Lord decided upon along with a few other things that were also up to their discretion. Any dungeon controlled would also have people pay to use or tax some of the materials earned inside of it. We had none of those things, so it was only pylon ownership that I gained from the oath. Tracy's 6 pylons were now under my control, and she even had a vassal of her own. I didn't know that the southern camp had sworn fealty to her, but now they were under me as well, along with the 5 pylons they managed to capture. With the time that was left, there wasn't a chance of me making it back up north. It wasn't like I had to, as everything was already planned for, but that meant I had nothing to do for the last 20 minutes of the tutorial. I couldn't conquer a pylon in that time or do anything of significance, only sit and wait for the end. Not wanting to loom around Tracy's camp, I walked a bit away into the jungle before sitting down on a rock, hammer to my side, and waited for the tutorial to end. I couldn't help but think over everything that had happened. The changed man that had entered and turned into what I was now. Wonder about the fate of humanity, whether my mother and brother were still alive. I didn't like to think about what she and Gabe were doing. It wasn't healthy to constantly think about. There was no way to know what they were going through or confirm whether they were alive. They would be my first stop when I returned. Running home as fast as possible to make sure both of them still lived. If they weren't, no. Don't think like that. As the timer approached 0, Abigail's voice sounded in my head. They managed to get one more. 31 total. Rachel succeeded. Bloodlines secured. At least there was some good news to end this nightmare. We accomplished what we had set out for, and we were ready for the return to Earth. With 31 pylons under our faction, along with 6 from Tracy and 5 from the southern camp, we had 42 out of 50. 84% of the total pylons in the tutorial were ours. Tutorial end. 00:00:02:01. I couldn't help but think about the prizes we would get for accomplishing such a feat. Surrendum. Point of view. Sweat pooled on his face as he paced outside the opulent doors. The heat bleeding through even the strongest of formations lining the entry to his patron's domain was higher than normal. Waves of it rolled off of the doors visible to even the lowest rank eye. The worry he felt was almost debilitating and his knees felt like they were about to give out. While keeping track of the integration tutorial, he couldn't help the mounting dread that built up. There weren't supposed to be any survivors, yet there had been many. Under 10% was still wildly outside the average deviation compared to all of the tutorials taking place, but that wasn't how his patron did things. Caring not for the fact that they most likely had the lowest survival rate in all the integration, the fact there were survivors was a problem. Not a problem for the participants, but for Surrendum himself. Survivors in the tutorial he supervised did not lead to a healthy and fulfilling life. It led to a short and hot end with his family soon to follow. Probably everyone he knew soon after if his patron was in a particularly bad mood. Still, it was his duty to report the end and there was no getting out of it. No matter how hard he tried and wished to be anywhere else in the multiverse. He steeled himself the best he could before pushing through the heavily decorated plated doors and into the inferno. The doors scalded his scales as he brushed them open. The fires raged hotter than normal, which did not signal a good start to what would surely be his end. They nipped at him as he passed through, burning and searing his flesh. Even his body, which had been tempered by fire, couldn't handle the flames his patron controlled. Sweat traced down his features for more reasons than one as he knelt down at the foot of the Sovereign Flame's throne. No acknowledgement came until blackened and burnt scales marred his form. The raging fires were too much for his defenses to handle, but he stayed silent as he burned. He would not add to his transgressions by speaking out of turn. Finally, he was given permission to speak. "My lord, the tutorial draws to a close and I need your approval on matters concerning its end." Surrendum spoke in the clearest tone. He could, even as his body wanted nothing more than to sprint away from the being he faced. With there being survivors, Surrendum couldn't close the tutorial under his own power. The sponsor of the tutorial, his patron, had a chance to bless any participants that he chose before the other gods who watched had the chance. There was little possibility of that happening, but it was still outside of his control. The system itself wouldn't let him bring the tutorial to a conclusion. Hence his presence here. The fire flared briefly before leveling out at the heightened intensity it had reached. "I am aware of what is needed." Short and clipped was his patron's response. Surrendum didn't have the courage to defend himself. 113 survivors out of an initial 1,344. A survival rate of 8.4%, the lowest of the subject's entire world. Lower than even the White Hordes, even those lunatics had more survivors than his. Once the tutorial was planned, it took significant effort to change, and how was he supposed to know they would all come together and only defend one camp? That rarely happened, and if it did, it was too late to do anything. There weren't enough people to defend against the waves to survive. Except this time, that didn't happen. Plus, the aberration that his tutorial involved was outside of his power to control. Rather than crumbling under the pressure and loss, the being leaned on his warrior spirit to survive. The likelihood of one of his participants forming a spirit of the warrior was so minuscule, statistically, that it wasn't even considered. The odds were so low they were effectively zero. Still, he clamped his mouth and awaited his punishment. Not daring to say anything else lest he curse his family line worse than he already had. Except the flame and heat never came. The burning end he anticipated never came. "Go, I will take care of it," his patron said, and dismissed him with a heated wave, the scalding air blackening more of his scales as he knelt. At first, he thought it was a trick and stayed kneeling where he was, a test to see if he would leave with haste and run from punishment. It wasn't until his patron's aura bore down on him that he was forced to flee. His body refused to endure and made him leave instinctively. not willing to stay in the same room as the being pressing down on him, and fled without his brain being able to do anything about it. Even as he rushed away, he couldn't help but dread the other shoe dropping. Flame Sovereign Callum. Point of view. The flames rose to the ceiling, turning white-hot after the peasant left. He could feel the trembling his assistant was trying and failing to hide. There was nothing that could hide inside his domain. His fire saw everything. The dragonkin was so weak his scales burned from his fire. Callum took a perverse pleasure in burning things that weren't meant to be burnt. A fire dragon's scales were almost indestructible against flames, yet he had done it anyway. That did little to ease his frustration. While abnormalities were possible and had happened before, they ruined his experiments and fouled his mood. They were outliers that were unaccountable, for which was a constant bane he had to deal with over the integrations. Watching the broken one corrupt others and break their minds was thrilling to watch, but it was hard to ignore the ending he had lived. His fun had ended and his fascination was no more. This wasn't the first time it had happened, and it wouldn't be the last, but it still frustrated him every time an aberration popped up. The incomplete feeling of a job not finished was hard to get over. Still, he had to do what was required of him or the system would penalize him, and no one wanted that. He prepared some of his pre-recorded endings and called it a day, unwilling to spend any more time on the failure. Instead, he thought ahead to what he could do better. The ants would die in a few years anyway. What did it matter that they lived for a few more? None of them would make it to godhood. Increasing the rewards for conquest should incite more violence. Changing the pylon structure could incentivize it, even by making them closer together. Boosting the rewards for killing others more than stray monsters could be a fun avenue to test. His mind forgot the inconsequential ants that lived and began toiling with ideas of his future experiments, looking ahead to the next chance he would have. For he would do to others what was done to him. Chapter 129 Prizes. Chris. Point of view. When the timer ticked to 0, my vision went black and I felt the same sensation as I had 90 days prior. Teleportation. The room I appeared in was different than the one I was expecting. It wasn't the nauseatingly bright white that I thought it would be. It had rocky walls that had a molten orange glow to them, like they were illuminated by the lava underneath, and there was a slight heat to it that matched that description. My survey of the room was quick as I swiveled and looked for threats. The bare rock face was the same all around, for identical walls filling my view topped off by a rocky ground and ceiling. Before I could question the bare room I was placed inside, a person appeared in the center. I wasn't an expert on monster biology, but I would bet a hefty amount of money that the horns and scales dotting the man were draconic in origin. There wasn't a way for me to tell if they were real draconic parts, but they felt different than anything I had ever seen. I wasn't certain if it was the horns that were the root of the feeling, or the person itself, but it was difficult to focus on. Something was pressing on my mind as I stood there, almost like I couldn't handle being in the same room as what was in front of me. Other than the horns, there were a few more alterations that made the person distinctly not human, or not pure human. With the alterations people could make, that was going to be difficult to observe. With all the odd powers out there, it was impossible to tell if this was dragon in human form, or a human with dragon modifications, or something else entirely. I couldn't rule out that option. While I looked my new companion over and walked around the room, it started to speak. At the wall. Congratulations, participant, for surviving the tutorial. The words were uniform in tone, clear in their lack of enthusiasm or excitement. The delivery of congratulations was nearly sarcastic in dryness. To succeed where others failed and harness determination and grit to advance farther than most. The words continued and I couldn't help but get distracted. Congratulations? Drive? Others failed? That was a funny way of putting it. Throwing people in a death trap and then saying that people failed for not surviving? That my family had failed? The being continued its soliloquy while I seethed at what was said. The insinuation that it was our fault that we failed angered me. That it was because of something we did to deserve the deaths we had. If you get stronger and seek out the Sovereign of Flame, he might take you into his pantheon. Rejoice, for he is the one who blessed you with this opportunity. While he will not bestow his blessing upon you now, He might in the future if you prove your worth. The words stopped registering after that. Rejoice? Blessed me? Anger ignited and my hammer leaped into my hand. The insinuation that this was a blessing drove me over the edge. This was hell. Torture that a sick and twisted mind thought up. It was not a blessing. Saying I should feel grateful for the opportunity to watch my family die was too far. My hammer was out and swinging before my mind registered what I was doing. Even when my mind caught up, I went through with it anyway. My hammer passed through the person in front of me like it wasn't even there, like a hologram parting around an object before snapping back into place. I swung a few more times to the same effect. It was a recording. We went through hell, survived waves upon waves of monsters, lived through the 90 days, and we were congratulated by a recording. There was nothing I could do. It babbled on about this or that, and I could do nothing to stop it. My attacks passed through like air, and there didn't seem to be an off switch. I had to sit while it preached how benevolent it was to give me the opportunity it had. If I hadn't wanted to kill the person responsible before, I sure as shit did now. Ignoring the babbling recording was difficult without anything else to do, but I managed. The words wrapped up not long after, keeping the recording brief but still insulting. As the recording finished, the familiar feeling of teleportation happened again without any warning. The recording ended and I was off. For some reason it felt like there was supposed to be something in between those two events. The only thing I could do was hope I didn't have to go through something similar again. This time, when the light hit me again, it was the blaring white I had expected the first time. The bright room along with the guide was my only company. My seething anger cooled so I could process what was going on. Congratulations, human. You have survived the tutorial integration and are ready to return to your planet. For accomplishing that feat, rewards will be given based upon your performance. At least this time the congratulations seemed a bit sincere, even though I knew it was a robotic figure giving it. You may see how many tutorial reward points you have by opening the shop menu. If you have any questions or need help to aid your search, you may query me by voicing your concern. The unnaturalness of the guide was less surprising this time around and made it easier to get through the process. This was more in line with what I was expecting, not the experience earlier that ruined my mood. A place to choose my rewards before being teleported back to Earth. Having been through this once before, I listened to the guide and brought up the shop menu to see how many points I had. I wasn't sure if they were the same points as before, but I doubted it. They were called something else and referred to differently. When the tutorial ended, I didn't have any points carried over, so I didn't have a way to test that claim. I had given them all to Abigail before I left. Glancing at the number made my eyes go wide and made me speechless. It was a big number. So big that I initially thought I miscounted and added a 0 or 2 at the end. It was in the billions. The encyclopedia-style list of tabs and sections of the store only seemed more daunting after knowing how much I had to spend. The countless items up for purchase seemed endless and my points bottomless. I knew I would be getting a lot, but this seemed absurd. My initial exploration led to subsections of subsections, with even more items available to buy. There was everything in the store. Gear, weapons, skills, materials, information, anything. Anything I could possibly think of to buy was there, and then some. Some of the items I didn't even know were a thing until I saw them available in the store. This was going to take a while. There was a list I had made of things I wanted to buy as a reward, but it needed to be updated. I had way more points than I expected, and there were way more items available for purchase than I imagined. Those two facts combined made me reevaluate the entire situation. One thing that I needed and knew for certain I would buy was information. I wasn't sure what exactly I would be able to get, but I knew I needed a map. The planet had irrevocably changed, and I needed a map before anything else. Are there maps of the planet after the terraforming? There were too many tabs to search for it myself, so I relied on the guide to show me. Wordlessly, the screen in front of me displaying the possible items changed, switching to a list of maps that were available. There were options of different sizes, like maps of regions, continents, and the entire globe, along with different information the maps showed. A lot of different maps that were available. They went up in price the bigger area it showed, along with the more detailed it was. Some got to asinine prices with the entire globe showing every minute detail. I didn't need any of the fancy ones. The reason I wanted a map was for the placement of my city. There were things that I wanted near it that made placement important. Type of mana density, the closest dungeon, and total number of dungeons. All were important for where I was going to build a city. The most important and highest priority was defensibility. Anywhere I built, it needed to be easily defensible. It couldn't be on an open plain that was assailable from every side. Fortification needed to be prioritized and placement was a big part of that, but it also couldn't be too far away from points of interest. I wouldn't be able to get everything from the map itself, but it would make it easier to find possible spots to survey. Places near dungeons and of the mana type I wanted. From what we knew, we would be put back in the same spot we had been taken from. I and my family would return to my grandparents' backyard in southwest Ohio. The maps didn't show much, and it seemed like they were blocked from perception unless you bought them. It would defeat the purpose if you got to see them without buying them, especially if you had good memory. Show me maps of the continent I will be returned to. None of them had labels or names to go along with them. There wasn't a North American map or a map of Europe. At least there were none I could see. The list shortened to only show what I assumed was the North American continent. It was impossible to tell without looking at them. Show maps with filters for mana type, density, and dungeon entrances. The list shortened further. I was left with a few different maps, all with similar prices that I could buy. Each was pricey but well worth it in my opinion. I purchased one of the options and moved on to the next thing on my list. I didn't want to spend a long time here because I didn't know if it would delay my return. I planned to get back as soon as possible without rushing to make sure the area we returned to was safe before trying to find my mom and brother. With the map secured, it came time for my big-ticket item. It was something I had known would suck up my points if there was an option for it, and there was. It was something I had discussed with others when we were fantasizing about what we would get at the end. I wanted to upgrade my affinity. There were countless affinities, and there were more than I had thought possible. Higher tiers of affinity, combinations of affinity, and slight variations as well. When thinking about what I wanted as a reward, my affinity was what I thought would be best. There was some debate about whether I wanted to add another, combine two together, or upgrade the one I already had, but doing something with my affinity was a clear choice for a reward. Ice could be upgraded a few different ways depending on what I wanted. Of the options, I decided upgrading it was the best option, and there were two I had to decide between: Glacier and Arctic. Glacier was the straight upgrade of my current ice affinity. Better in every way but without adding anything new. Arctic would boost my ice but not as much as Glacier, and focus more on the coldness of ice than the hardness of ice. In the trade-off, it added wind to the equation. So I would have both ice and wind as an affinity. Like how a storm affinity consisted of water, wind, and lightning, Arctic was ice and wind. It was predominantly ice still, but gave me more options to work with. It also had the benefit of the body refining technique I used. There were various ways to upgrade an affinity, but the way the store did it was through treasures. Certain treasures held the power to upgrade an affinity once eaten, and both options were available. While I loved my ice and would continue to go down that path, Arctic sounded better than Glacier to me and was the one I chose. It was exorbitantly expensive and was the majority of my points, but it would set me up for even more power as I grew. Next on my list was back to information. In the tutorial, we managed to unlock 3 of the 4 paths of power, and I wanted to know the last one. We were told what it was, but we weren't given anything else on it or how to take the first step. It was called mana cultivation, and it was a part of the body trinity. Both it and body refining were a part of the body for some reason. The list that was shown was similar in length to all the different body refining techniques I had seen before, and there were thousands of different options. All of them claimed to boost something different, and it would take forever to get through them all and didn't seem worth it. Especially when all of them were so similar in their benefits. Just from the first page, I saw 7 that boasted doing the same thing, only slightly different. From the little information we knew, affinity was the deciding factor for which technique to use. All of them were designed for a specific affinity. Mana cultivation was different than body refining in that regard. You weren't able to use a technique for an affinity you didn't have. Mana was picky like that. I still wasn't sure what exactly mana cultivation was, and I didn't have a lot to go on, which made my search even more difficult. Filtering by the Arctic affinity didn't help. Hundreds were still on the list as options. Without anything else to go off of, I turned to the only other thing that could help me. Show me mana cultivation techniques for the Arctic affinity that will suit me best. I wasn't sure if that would work or not, but I tried it anyway. There was a slight glitch on the screen before only one option remained. The hitch seemed unnatural for an all-powerful system, but I dismissed it as filtering out my request. Without any reason to say no, I bought it before moving on to the other things I needed to get. It seemed good enough if the guide only narrowed it down to one. Next on my list was the Northern Winds technique for Body of Stone. I had used the technique to reach Body of Wood and wished to continue with it to reach Body of Stone. I wasn't sure if I would be able to get my hands on it later and wanted to make sure I had it now just in case. Next up was the Civilization Pylon. It was one of the last things I had to get and soaked up more of my quickly dwindling points. With how many I had, they sure disappeared quite fast. With that done, I wanted to ask for something outside of the norm. There was only one thing left I planned to spend points on, and I wanted to see if my idea was possible before I spent everything on my last purchase. Are things that aren't listed available to purchase? I asked. The same hitch in response as before happened before the guide answered my question. What is it you want that is not listed? It voiced. The voice was different than before. Instead of robotically requesting me to define my query, it asked in a more personable manner. Plus, its voice was normally robotic in nature, but this one sounded almost human and more feminine. To answer, I clarified, I want the hill. The guide stared at me for a moment before I realized it had no idea what I was talking about. The hill adjacent to our pylon that was our cemetery. I specified. It was a long shot, but I hoped to take it with me. I didn't want to leave them there. The guide took a long moment to answer, and it seemed almost conflicted. Is it the remains you want? Those can be extracted. No, I want the entire hill. Paused again. It will be expensive. I don't care, I replied. In front of me, a new item popped up on the list, and the guide was right. It was expensive. Not as bad as my affinity upgrade, but up there nonetheless. The main reason it was so much was because of storing it. What I was asking for was tons of dirt and rock that I wouldn't possibly be able to carry. Most of the cost came from the ring it was stored in. I knew that storage devices were a thing, but they weren't available until higher ranks. They weren't even available in the prize store to buy. I looked. The only things available were spatially expanded packs. The ring wasn't a storage device exactly, but it served the same purpose. It would hold the hill in limbo until I wanted to place it. It would then deposit what was inside before breaking. It would let me take the hill with me and place it where I wanted. I didn't care if it crumbled to dust after, as long as it did what I needed it to. The price tag hurt, but I thought it was worth it. I wasn't going to leave my family in that place. There were a few smaller things I purchased from the store that caught my eye while I searched that I picked up now before dumping the rest of my points on my last purchase. While scrolling through the different blacksmithing tabs, there was a list of different spirit fires, and I purchased one of those. An ice affinity spirit fire sounded counterintuitive, but it would help me with my smithing. Vinny had convinced me to look for them, which was why I saw them in the first place and knew what they were. A fire affinity one was on the list of things he wanted to buy, and his babbling drew my attention to getting one of my own. Some others popped up here and there, but there wasn't much else I wanted to spend points on. There was still one more purchase I had to make, but I had points to spare for a few more small things if I wanted. There were a few skills I picked up with the last of my spare points before I searched for the topic I was assigned and my last purchase. Identify blocker, common, being the biggest one. Before we left, Abigail gave us all topics we were in charge of acquiring from the store. Different things that we would need when we returned. As an example, someone was in charge of buying farming equipment, seeds, and knowledge about plants and growing conditions. Things that we would need while building a city. People were assigned different things to buy so we could split the cost while still getting everything we needed. My topic was formation materials. One big factor that was different between the tutorial and when we would be returned was we had to build everything ourselves. There were no walls that popped into place, no defenses that magically appeared. That was a tutorial-only occurrence. Everything we needed had to be built with our own two hands. One of the biggest things we needed to make were the formations and wards lining the walls. To make the strongest city we could, those were a requirement. Being the leading expert in such matters, it was left to me to get the materials necessary. With the last of my points, I loaded up on rare metals and crystals that were needed for strong wards and formations. With everything spent, it was time to go back home. Couldn't wait. Chapter 130, Return to Earth. The feeling of being teleported washed over me once more, and I could feel my anticipation rising. We were finally going to see what the Earth had turned into. We were finally going home. I had to shield my eyes from the glaring sun as I took everything in around me as it filtered into my eyes. Lily and Anna appeared right in front of me, looking around much the same as I was, just like how we left. The clothes they were wearing were starkly different than before, but we returned in the same spots we had left. Others appeared simultaneously, and soon, the backyard was filled with what remained of my family. Backyard was a strong word to describe what I was seeing. It wasn't really a backyard anymore. The house was mostly gone, vines and plant matter grown in, around, and through the building. The walls were knocked over from either weather or animals and left to rot and sink into the dirt. The structure itself looked rotted through and nearly finished decomposing entirely. It looked like decades had passed rather than only 3 months. That was just what was left of the house. The plants were the main feature that changed. The grass was a wild mess, reaching higher than Anna was tall. Trees, bushes, shrubs, and grass dominated the landscape in places they hadn't before. The concrete of the driveway and paving stones around the yard had plants growing through it, leaving it cracked and in disarray, little more than gravel. Bugs sounded out in the new environment we were placed, chirping and buzzing, turning it closer to the wilds than the curated backyard we had left. Earthy scents mixed with plants, greenery and humidity, even with the remnants sparking old memories of what was. All of the changes solidified in my mind. It didn't even smell the same. We had our expectations, of course, but this was outside of them. All right, gather up. Make sure everyone is here. Abigail's authoritative voice sounded out. With a quick count, all of us were accounted for, down to the last child. Before we got any further organization done, materials and equipment began to appear around us. Huge piles of metal and stone, crystals and gems. Some gear was strewn around as well. Booklets stacked neatly on the ground along with other treasures. In the center of it all, a pylon hovered just above the grass, visible to all. It was easily seen, but it could also be felt. It had something magical about it, making us aware that it was there, like a magical beacon alerting us of where it was. All of the things we had spent our reward points on. I had been trying to be more leader ly, and I took this time to make good on that effort. All right, Hal and Austin, get to scouting. Braden, Vinny, and Allison, get working on preliminary defenses. Rachel, keep a magical ear to the ground so nothing can sneak up on us. My voice carried to everyone near. Everyone else, gather and sort the prizes or help out where you can. I still found it odd to order around my family, but working on predetermined assignments made it easier. We had planned what we were going to do upon our return already, and all I had to do was voice it. We weren't sure how hostile the environment was going to be, so our priorities were scouting and getting at least some defenses up. They wouldn't be permanent walls and fortifications or anything, but something quick and easy to at least give us cover. While everyone broke away to take care of their tasks, I went to grab the prize that was calling to me. It was inside of a carved wooden box, but I could feel the power inside leaking out. The power of the Arctic. It was the treasure that was going to upgrade my affinity. I wouldn't be able to take it now, but I wanted to keep it on me at least. It was the most expensive of my purchases, and I didn't want it out of arm's length from me. The rest of what I purchased stayed waiting to be sorted. The map of North America, Northern Wind's body refining technique for body of stone, stars of primordial frost mana cultivation technique, the ring storing the hill, the spirit fire, and the rare metals and crystals for formations could wait for now. The metals and crystals would have to wait until we set down roots at the place we planned to build our city. The ring would wait until then as well. The booklets would be useful when I had the free time to read them, most likely seeing use along the long journey, no doubt. The map would be getting the soonest use when we got around to planning our journey north. Then the fruit of the Arctic would be next, giving me one last bump before we set out into the unknown. While everyone went about their tasks, I got to the heavy lifting. I had the most strength out of everyone, and I used it to hasten the building of our camp. Quick chopping of trees with a conjured frosty axe and laying them along a perimeter. Braden came through and solidified them with his skills, making them anchor to each other and the ground. Vinny pounded nails through the wood with ease, moving along the quickly erected berm of tree trunks. Allison set some traps in the area for both detection and alarm. They weren't lethal in nature but used to alert us of anything coming. That part was beginning to worry me. I half expected a war zone of animals fighting each other upon our return, but it turned out nothing like that. There hadn't been a critter in sight yet. Without having a chance to examine the maps I had bought, I couldn't confirm, but I assumed we were in a low point for mana density, which made the beasts scarce. A lucky break after the months we had been through. While we worked with haste, Austin and Hal came jogging back into camp. Both came up to me with their findings. I thought Abigail was the better option, but I wasn't going to tell them to leave. Nothing of any significance in the north and east. The highest level I saw was in the 30s, barely in F rank. Hal said, "Same here. South and west look clear with around the same levels." Austin said. I nodded at the information. It was unexpectedly turning out well. Refraining from voicing that sentiment out of fear of jinxing it, I looked to Abigail to see if my job here was done. We planned for me to stay until it was deemed safe. With our initial surroundings scouted and nothing dangerous found, we were as safe as we could be. Abigail nodded, not giving permission per se, but agreeing with my conclusion and acknowledging I would be leaving. "All right, keep scouting farther out. I doubt there will be a huge jump in levels, but it's people I worry about this time," I said. People had proved to be both good and bad in our tutorial, and we had to watch out for them just as much as the beasts we would encounter. My grandparents' house was mostly isolated without many other houses near it, but we weren't that far away from the city. Even if every tutorial only had 10% of the planet survive like ours, we would run into people eventually. The nearest city was a good 20 to 30-minute drive, and that was with roads. I had no idea how long it would take now. Too many things changed to make a good estimate. Speed, terrain, distance, almost everything was altered in some way. With my job finished, I grabbed the map from the sorted piles and searched for where we were. There were no markers for cities or towns, nor roads and highways. The only thing it showed was rivers and oceans along with mountains, the natural landmarks. The topography was shown to measure altitude, but that meant little to me. I knew the surrounding area from a driving standpoint. To take this exit off the highway, or turn right on this street. Not which way was uphill or downhill, or the slope of the ground I was driving on. Hills were easy to remember, but those changed. The entire landscape changed. Direction was the only thing I could depend on. My parents' house was northeast of where I currently was, and that was the only thing I had to go on. I was lucky the remnants of civilization were still around and I could make out certain landmarks, but it wouldn't be as straightforward as before. My initial perusal of the map made me dazed. If I hadn't had a purpose to fulfill, I would have spent a long while going over all of the changes, but I didn't have time for that. I needed to get to my parents' house as quickly as possible. The map only showed what I assumed was North America. The shape had been altered and the telltale signs were harder to spot. The Florida peninsula had broken off and become a series of connected islands. Mexico was deformed in odd ways I couldn't pinpoint. The coastline had been altered and didn't look the same as before, making state borders impossible to discern. Even the border between the US and Canada had changed, stretching in some places and scrunching in others. All maps from before would have to be thrown out, the changes were so bad. The US and Mexico border was still visible, and that was only because of the river delineating it. The Rio Grande still marking the two countries apart. The Great Lakes did the same up north, but it wasn't as clear as the river and only marked part of the border. Based on topography, the mountains had been irrevocably altered. Those stood out the most compared to the other changes. They were huge. The lines marking their rise were so close together that they looked like thick bars rather than the thin topography lines elsewhere. Both the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains. The Rockies damn near split the country in half, spanning from deep into Mexico running all the way into Canada. They were altered from what I remembered, much taller and wider than before. Mysteries for how that worked had to wait because I focused on the area familiar to me. Anyone from Ohio, or most of the Midwest for that matter, knew how to locate based off of the Great Lakes. The Five Giants were the biggest landmarks that were visible on any map of the area. Noting Lake Erie, before narrowing it down further once the curves of the Ohio River became noticeable. With the borders of state and country gone, I had to go off of what was still there. Finding where I was confirmed we were in a lower mana density area than other parts of the map. The mountains were a deep blue in color, the gradient signifying density damn near glowed as the mountains grew more prominent. Without a map of the globe, I couldn't pick out the highest area of density, but there were multiple hotspots that I could see just in North America. Mountains, the convergence of the Great Lakes, spots along the coast, and different areas inland all had the deep blue marking hotspots of high mana density. From what I could count, there were dozens of spots where mana converged and rose sharply in density. The types were all different as well. Water, wind, earth, and fire were the most common, but there were other tones of color marking different ones. Lightning was a flash of purple along with a different one that I thought meant storm. One was an eerie teal that gave off an uncomfortable feeling even though it was only a map. That one was near what I thought was Virginia. All of that wasn't what mattered right now. Not even the deep icy blue of the far north was enough to draw my attention away. I spent a few more minutes deciphering the map before I began sprinting northeast. The tutorial demanded that survival skills be learned, and they came in handy now. Which way was north was almost instinctual by now. As I ran, the scenery that passed by became more and more different. Our house seemed to be one of the better off. Others were broken into pieces or collapsed into rubble. Some I knew had once been there were completely gone. The road was the most derelict. It was in chunks, plants reclaiming the area along with odd stretches of dirt in between the ruined concrete. Most likely from the expansion of the earth. We had been told that the earth had grown, but it wasn't until I saw the effects with my own eyes that it gave a better picture. Distance was hard to judge now with stats and the walking speed not being the same, but seeing the road broken apart and some houses sheared in two from the expansion made it clear. We weren't told the exact extent the earth had grown, but it was predicted to double, if not more. The grade of the planet would determine its size, and we were unable to purchase that information from the store. Or if we didn't have a high enough pylon to do so. Not knowing was uncomfortable since the grade would determine a lot of things about our new world. Primarily, it dictated how high level the beasts of the planet would get, and that was something I needed to know. The grade came from the planetary core that sat at the heart of the earth. It spewed out both mana and essence from the core, saturating the planet, giving life to the creatures and plants. The grades came from the ranks of classes. It directly correlated to how high a level you could reach on a specific planet. C-grade planets would only have the mana and essence levels to sustain C ranks. B-grade would only have up to B ranks. There were exceptions, obviously, but that was the general rule. If a person murdered everything on a planet over and over again, they would eventually outrank the planet they were on, but that was a waste of effort. It was far easier to travel to a different planet of a higher grade to continue to grow. You could nurture the planetary core and grow it in grade, but that was a costly endeavor. Only the richest factions did something like that. That meant if I continued growing, I would eventually have to leave, but that wouldn't come for a while yet. Without the waves of beasts delivering experience no essence at my door, getting through E rank was going to take longer. And D rank even longer than that. On average in the multiverse, between all the different races and peoples, it took anywhere from half a year to 5 years to get through E rank, depending on how often you fought and if there were dungeons you could frequent. D rank was 25 to 50 years. C rank was 100 to, well, a lot. That was why dungeons were so fiercely fought over. Having one would have your growth closer to the lower bound compared to the higher one. Growing without a dungeon could be done, but it was harder. Finding things to hunt took longer and beasts of a certain level were more spread out. You could also collect the essence in the air, but that was both boring and slow, requiring a different technique than normal hunting. The time it took to climb the ranks went up the higher you went, and lifespan increased with it. Based on the map, there were a few dungeons near us, but they were sparse. There definitely weren't enough for everyone, and there would be fighting for ownership. The closest one was to the southwest, along the Ohio River and a good march away, and was in the opposite direction I was going. I began to see more animals and beasts that populated the grassy plains and clusters of trees, but nothing too high level. One neared Erank but was still a way off. It eased my mind a little that we wouldn't be thrown out of the pan and into the fire. We would be given a chance to rest, to recover before preparing for the trip. But first, there were some people to pick up. My mother and brother to start before the others would go for their extended family. Jonathan had his parents he wanted to check in on, and other in-laws needed to get theirs. Some were shit out of luck with family on the other side of the country, and they had to come to terms with that. Some would be crushed when they couldn't find who they were looking for. I was hoping that wouldn't be me. End of chapter 130.